back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. We're spending this episode talking to Timothy Kane, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, about his new book, The Immigrant Superpower: How Brains, Brawn, and Bravery Make America Stronger. The book argues that immigration is central to the United States' economic power and national security. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. This episode, we're welcoming a longtime friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Tim Kane. He is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and formerly the J.P. Conte Research Fellow in Immigration Studies there. He earned his PhD in economics from the University of California, San Diego, and is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and a military veteran. His career background includes serving as a senior economist on the staff of the Joint Economic Committee in the U.S. Congress. He was director of the Center for International Trade and Economics at the Heritage Foundation. And in 2018, he ran as a Republican candidate in Ohio's 12th congressional district in a special election. His latest book is all about immigration, and I'm happy to talk with him about it. You can follow Tim on Twitter at TimmerKane, Kane. Welcome to the podcast, Tim.
Teresa, it's so good to see you again.
It's great to have you here. So before we get to the book, let's talk a little bit about you. You come from a military background. You have a long history in economics, and you kind of fell into immigration research. How did your other experiences influence your ideas about immigration?
You know, it's funny you say I fell into it, and you know that better than most because I started to work on this with my military background. And I found, of all the think tank scholars or academic scholars, the one person I could reach out to and say, what is really going on in immigration policy was you. So this is a long time friendship, and it's really great to talk again. And by the way, if I get anything wrong while I'm talking, you can go ahead and correct me on air. That's fine.
That's fine.
So yeah, I was a Midwestern kid. I had parents that went to all these different Big Ten schools, and there was a lot of pressure about which school I was going to go to. So as my appeal to centrism was, I decided to join the military, and then everybody could be proud, right? So, and when I was at the Air Force Academy, I met a lot of friends from all over the country, different cultures, melting pot in a way is what the military is. And then I served in a particular branch of intelligence called human intelligence. So we're known as the guys that do combat interrogation and debriefings and, work with the CIA sometimes. It was a lot of fun. But what I found were some of the very patriotic Americans that do this very quiet work were foreign born. And they speak a different language at home. Their parents had often immigrated and they were second generation. But man, did they love their country. And so that was really my first taste, aside from the family stories, right? I mean, the Kanes are an Irish clan that came over here in the 1830s and 40s. And, according to Grandpa Kane, once they lowered the standards to let in the Irish, all bets were off. Like anybody can get into America. So, no, very proud Irish American family, fought for the North in the Civil War, really believed in this idea. And so it sort of shocked me to be introduced to nativism, whether it's on the left, which is more of an economic nativism, and worry about immigrants stealing jobs, or a cultural nativism more on the right. As you know, I identify as a Republican. But tell you what, serving overseas and meeting so many of our allies in Asia and the rest of the world that admire America and want to be Americans totally shaped my perspective, which is, I believe this country is the greatest in the world. I want it to continue being the greatest, most powerful country in the world. And Teresa, we need immigrants to stay powerful.
Yeah. So I got to ask you about this congressional run. You ran for Congress in Ohio as a Republican on a pro-trade and pro-immigration platform in 2018. So what was that experience like?
That's all fake news. That was all from
news.
The New York Times.
Okay. Sorry.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I ran explicitly as a pro-immigration Republican. And the survey data that comes out of Gallup, Republican voters are extremely pro-immigration, and they've gotten more so. It's just they focus on legal immigration. And that was my message. We want more legal immigration, more scientists, more engineers, actually more refugees. It's just illegal immigration that Republicans have a hard time with. The lawlessness at the border is very frustrating. And then, of course, that does get exploited by some nativists on the right as well. So it was actually not an issue in the race. I found the other candidates were crowding to be the most pro-Trump, pro-America first. I'm an American leadership candidate. I believe that's the American role. So yeah, I loved saying I'm a pro-immigration Republican, and it turns out our polling showed 41% of Republican voters were more likely to vote for me just because of that. And only 41% were less likely. So, it was a wash. I let the other guys squabble over the anti-immigrant vote.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you didn't get elected.
That was about money. That wasn't about issues. I'm not as good a fundraiser as I need to be if I'm ever going to try that again.
Modern politics is very hard that way. But it's interesting because when you were running, Doug Holtz-Eakin, a mutual friend of ours, he's president of the American Action Forum, said your candidacy, the Republican Party needed people who would make the case for policies that are more popular with economists and with the general public, like immigration, fiscal restraint, and trade. And you were trying to bridge that gap. You were trying to, and you said you were pro-leadership. Do you think there really is a gap between sort of what economists think is good for America and what the public thinks?
I wouldn't agree with that. I love Doug. He and I had worked together on some different campaigns and issues. He's been a Republican appointee, so he comes from the sort of the same pro-market perspective. But I identify the real problem in America as politics has become a little bit lost, and it's because the journalism has died. I mean, the local paper that I used to deliver as a kid was this thick, beefy, investigative thing, the Columbus Dispatch. Now it's a wafer-thin pamphlet that picks up most of its stories from the AP. So there wasn't any substantive journalism coverage of the congressional campaign. I was begging, Teresa, the local TV stations, and there were 4, Channel 4, Channel 6, Channel 10, please do one story about who the candidates are. I was able to get on Fox News, CNN, NPR covering this race, but the local news has become very thin. And if it's not a school shooting or a car chase, it doesn't get covered. So it's all about fundraising, and that's been corrosive to our politics.
Yeah. So how much of your experience running for office in 2018 influenced or inspired this book? And who do you think is your audience for it? I should mention, I haven't given the book title. It's called The Immigrant Superpower: How Brains, Brawn, and Bravery Make America Stronger. And you can find it everywhere, including on Amazon. But tell me about how that race inspired the book.
Well, this is a book I was planning to write when I decided to table it to run for Congress. So coming back, it's something that I wanted to do. And, it is available on Amazon. Also, I'm proud it's available at Walmart. So we are doing a bad job marketing. So I'm going to say every sentence now, I'm going to start with the title of the book. So in The Immigrant Superpower, Teresa, when I was writing The Immigrant Superpower, so the congressional race mattered because the book talks about politics. But that's really a minor part. The biggest core of The Immigrant Superpower is about how immigration is really a national security issue, not about domestic economics. It's about how our country was able to win World War I and World War II and go toe-to-toe with the Soviets and become a world-beating economy with all this technology that's rooted in innovation, which is driven by folks with immigrant roots, very entrepreneurial part of the American culture.
Yeah. So let's get into the book itself. You titled it The Immigrant Superpower, and much of the book is both kind of a historical look at immigration in the United States and a treaty on how that immigration history helped America reach its superpower status. Talk about, more specifically, maybe why you believe America's history with immigration has been integral to its rise in power and influence.
I tell you, the reason that the book, The Immigrant Superpower, Teresa, the reason that it includes a presidential history is, as I did research, including talking to you, I learned so much about different presidents and their approach. And it was really fascinating because the presidents who are the most pro-immigration are not consistently in one part or the other. And so I was able to identify the presidents who, were the most open to immigration in terms of policy and in raw numbers. And the anti-immigrant presidents, and here we have to say FDR was pretty terrible at immigration policy. The president who presided over the fewest immigrants relative to population ever. He's a Democrat, but you also find some terrible Republicans. Calvin Coolidge was just just flat out racist by today's standards and by his era standards, and wanted to restrict immigration based on skin color and ethnicity. So, I was more happy to tell that story of the heroes. And I think Abraham Lincoln stuck out. It's not as if the man wasn't busy fighting a civil war, but he was also the very first president to propose legislation to attract more, to basically market to foreigners to come to America and not to fight in the Civil War. If they came, he give them an exemption. They didn't have to fight. He just recognized immigrants are the key to strength and power, and that's what the North needed. So Abe Lincoln, George Washington, then, of course, Lyndon Johnson, one of the great heroes of immigration. But the unsung hero in the book, and that I'm happy to tout, is George Bush Sr. He basically was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase of immigration policy. He doubled green cards, and he doesn't get enough accolades for how great he was in his single term.
I this is a little pet peeve of mine. I hear a lot of people saying we haven't reformed immigration law since 1986 and the Immigration Reform Act, and I'm like, you forget the 1990 Act, which liberalized our legal immigration system quite substantially, and that's where we are right now. And I'm a champion for Act 90. I really am. Yes, it was important what we did in '86, but it had to be followed by the 1990 Act. So I'm with you there. So your book has 3 chapters, and it's the subtitle of your book that kind of encapsulate how you see immigrants as being integral to the United States, where we are today. You call them Brawn, Bravery, and Brains. Tell us more about these 3 ideas and how they apply to immigrants.
So what's fun about this, Teresa, is when you write a book, the real challenge is structure. Like, I knew I wanted those 3 chapters in there. Should I have made them chapters 2, 3, and 4 after the introductory chapter? I ended up putting them pretty far back after a lot of history. I don't know if I got it right or wrong, but yeah, if you only read 3 chapters, I think those are the most important ones, which offhand I believe are 9, 10, and 11. So, Brawn. If we don't have immigration starting from the year 1790, and you just project forward, if we don't have immigration, our country is so much smaller. I think would be smaller than modern day Russia. But I know in World War II, the U.S. would have been smaller than Nazi Germany, just in raw population size. And I would attest, you just don't have the underlying foundation of national security power. And we wouldn't have fought a 2-front war, Pacific and the Atlantic. We may not have fought at all because we wouldn't probably have had a lot of German Americans and wouldn't have cared what was happening overseas. Instead, George Washington set the standard to keep America open. So the Brawn issue is just one of, what are the core ingredients to a nation's economy? And population is a key one. But you know what? It's not just raw labor. You want to have human capital. And that's where we get to the brains. And not just saying people with high IQ should come in. Brains means including all these other characteristics. And entrepreneurial inclination is one of those. People take the risk to uproot their family, to move to a different country. That's raw entrepreneurial risk-taking, risk-loving almost, to pursue something better. And it's why we see immigrants create, twice as many companies of all kinds per capita than the native-born, while they're integral to founding companies in Silicon Valley, for example. And it turns out, look at the bravery in combat. The Medals of Honor won by first and second generation immigrants account for roughly 45% of all Medals of Honor ever awarded. First generation alone, it's 20%. And as you know, there's never been our population being 20% foreign born. It's more like 10 to 15, sometimes 5. So we see they're punching above their weight, literally, in terms of taking risks heroically for their country.
You mentioned sort of the economic pieces, and I think, before we go on, like, you're an economist at heart, and you do a lot of debunking of different sort of economic ways of looking at immigration, and the way the current debate is set out in this book. And I tend to say that I think immigration gets oversold as either the cause or the solution of all of Americans' problems. And I don't think it's either. But I think this is especially true in the way you look at the economic arguments, because you just say kind of both sides tend to exaggerate a little here. And the reality is more a little of both. So tell me about how you see immigrants, how they do impact the economy.
So, yeah, I try to I wish I didn't have to write about the economics of immigration, honestly, Teresa, because to me, when you dig into the details as an economist, there's no debate. So I present George Borjas. I try to make it a very personal story in the book. George Borjas is sort of the leading advocate, praised by folks who are restrictionists. But I know Professor Borjas. George was a professor of mine when I was at UC San Diego. Now he's at Harvard. And I talk about Giovanni Perry, who's a friend, professor at UC Davis, who's seen as the advocate of greater immigration among economists. But, they agree way more than they disagree. Their debate is a very microeconomic debate. And what they basically agreed on is there's a very small, very temporary depression of wages for a very small category of unskilled Americans. But the other 8 out of 9 categories all benefit tremendously. And, all that to me is secondary. What about the macroeconomics? What about raw GDP? Because I'm telling you, when it's Russia versus the United States or the Soviets versus the United States squaring off, I didn't care about the microeconomics. I wanted to care how many tanks can they produce, right? How many missiles can they produce? How skilled and talented and intelligent are their troops? And so I was looking at a more macro issue. And I quote Borjas directly saying, oh yeah, no question. Immigrants enhance GDP, almost, pound for pound. In fact, I would argue there's a multiplier because when you get a diversity of thinkers, you also get more innovation. So it's a huge win-win on the macro front. And so I have 2 chapters in the book, one micro. I go through all the boring details. And I hopefully just put that issue to bed. And then I do the macro chapter, much more interesting. Look how we're growing. Every other country wishes they could grow as dynamically and quickly and be as wealthy and productive as we are. Case closed.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, one of the things I kind of say is, the proof is kind of in the pudding that we have seen the greatest periods of sustained economic growth, the same time we have seen the greatest periods of sustained immigration.
Right.
So if there really was a negative connotation there, you would think that would happen together. So there is something to be said there.
And don't get me wrong, for the 4 hardcore econometric readers out there, we get into some econometric studies and look at some time series analysis. And so no, I wanted to really be definitive, but not make that.
You have to defend your PhD economist status, right?
Those 4 readers, go ahead and buy the book. You'll be happy.
You have to show that. But you also then talk about and say that that there's more consensus among Americans on immigration, but that it's been hijacked by political partisanship. So first of all, where do you see that widespread consensus, and how has it been hijacked in your opinion?
Well, this is just my interest in polling. And when you look at, Gallup polls that go back decades and decades, and they'll ask the same questions again and again, there's been a massive shift in Americans becoming more pro-immigration across the board. Democrats are more pro-immigration, independents are more pro-immigration, and surprise, surprise, Republican voters are more pro-immigration. So what the heck is going on? And you find what my teenage daughter calls, there's a lot of drama in politics, right? So these folks in Congress or running for Congress, I experienced it firsthand, they focus on what to be outraged about. And that's not necessarily reflected in what voters want. They want common sense solutions on things as far ranging as abortion and budget deficits and, welfare policy, but especially immigration. I mean, the consensus sort of hiding in plain sight just boggled my mind. And I think the folks on the left are just as guilty. They'll make this about a race issue, and aren't Republicans racist? And that's not really what people are concerned about. Even Democrats are concerned about lawlessness at the border. So, both parties are not serving their constituents well. They've hijacked this issue. They've tried to make it radically emotional. It seems to be effective in their primaries when you get more radicalized voters. But in the general election, or especially after they win power, like Barack Obama had 60 votes in the Senate and a lock in the House for his 2 first years of. Where was the immigration bill, Teresa? I mean, that's when it was like, wake up call. They don't really want to solve this. They just want to keep fighting about it. So if we want to hijack this issue back as voters, we need to force them to focus on small things and stop with the nonsense of, we're going to do a big comprehensive immigration bill. They've been saying that it's an all or nothing piece of legislation since 1990, not 1986, and we get nothing. So, I think we'll win in the end, but we have to put up with the drama
The drama. Unfortunately, I live in the drama a lot. Our own polling at BPC has shown some of the same things you are, that part of it is the framing of the issue, right? If you listen to the politicians talk, particularly if they're talking in the media, you think that there are only two options: open borders or build a wall. And you think that there's only two options, which is kick them all out or keep them all or let them all in. And the answer is it's neither of those. There's a lot of space in between there for us to figure something out. And I think that's where most Americans are in trying to figure that out. You also talked about how immigration is essential to the American identity. And this is where I really loved sort of your historical traipse through time. Can you expand on that a little bit and why you think that, aside from like the trope that we're a nation of immigrants, why do you think it's so integral to our identity as a country?
Well, it just shocked me to realize, America may not be forever. It's constantly changing. It's like a river. It's just always flowing, always evolving, and it evolves a little bit more quickly than I realized as a boy. And if it ever comes to pass that people feel like, well, we're done, we've reached this perfect state, we've got the right mix of people, we don't need anymore. Americans actually did that once in 1921. They didn't want, quote, beaten men from beaten races. I was really surprised, I guess, to find out how much nativism there was against the Irish, against the Italians. There's a history of lynching of Italian Americans a century ago that I found really disturbing. We usually think lynchings was only applied to black and white issues, so to speak. But, that sort of ugliness was, it hurt. It created a lot of division among Protestants, Catholics, or Jews. And now we've evolved to a point where everybody thinks it's white, black, which I just thought was so funny that there really isn't a whiteness historically. It was a shorthand for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and didn't include even swarthy Germans, according to Ben Franklin. So, yeah, what I found is our real identity is not Judeo-Christian values. It's George Washington's confidence that this country was going to be an experiment. And part of that experiment, part of the Declaration of Independence, was that we wouldn't let no one block immigration, certainly not the British Crown, because they knew that was a path to weakness. So it's sort of bizarre now. You have these nativists who think they're representing real America, totally going against this core identity of, to use a song title from my youth, we are the world, right? That's our identities. We represent not one race, not one creed, not one religion. We're open to all. It's common humanity, enlightenment values that apply to everyone. I think that's going to win out, Teresa. I've just been a little surprised that it's been such a constant fight. And I think we're maybe in the last chapter of that fight because there aren't many groups to be unwelcoming to left.
That may be true. So you do finish the book with some prescriptions for reforming immigration, but it starts with a frame of preparation for war, which, given your military background and you talk about the immigrant superpower, it seems slightly prescient now that we are, again, facing somewhat of a renewed conflict with Russia over the Ukraine. But that framing puts a very different spin on traditional arguments about immigration. So, we said that you're economists. There's lots of examination of economics in this book. But in the end, you say, let's view immigration through a foreign policy and national security lens. Why is that important to you?
So one of the great stories that I was able to tell in The Immigrant Superpower was about my friend France Hong, who was a West Point graduate, but was started as a refugee, 2 years old, coming from Vietnam. Went to West Point. It's funny because his parents didn't want him to go. They'd had enough of war, and his mom tried to have him arrested on the day he left for the airport. But, police had to explain to her, he's 18 years old, he's allowed to make his own choice. I mean, that kind of patriotism pays off. France served in Afghanistan. He left the White House counsel's office to go fight again because he believed in helping people in Afghanistan, which reminded him of himself. So another story, looking back at U.S. history, was about President Harry Truman. In the wake of World War II, Truman authorized a program called Operation Paperclip to bring over Nazi scientists and engineers who could help build the weapons for possibly World War III. And the thought was, whoever was going to win World War III would have the better Germans. Our German scientists were going to have to be better than their German scientists. It was a very cold, calculating move. And, that not politically correct approach prioritized defeating communism and defending freedom. Well, I think today, the war that potentially looms on the horizon is between tyrannical states like China and states that still believe in Enlightenment values like the United States and the West and NATO. So, the next war might be based on who has more Chinese AI engineers and scientists. And I hope to heck we have more. And I think we will win that future conflict. I think our system is better, but I also think immigration's key to that. And we need to take a lesson and a page from history and a page from Harry Truman's book.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. I will go ahead and recommend that you take a look at The Immigrant Superpower. It is a very good read. And in spite of having a lot of economics in it and detailed, it even has charts and graphs for those who really need it. But it's also a very easy to read book. I admire you for being able to put a lot of this into a lot more simple language. Maybe that's your campaign experience there. Tim Kane, thank you so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
Oh, thanks, Teresa. And I appreciate you plugging The Immigrant Superpower, which is also available as an audiobook for those who have liked hearing my voice. So I got it. Oh, by the way, I tell a quick anecdote and then you can close. I said, I'll sell it to Audible only if I get to read it. And my agent said, Tim, you're not that big a deal. So anyway, they did let me read it. And maybe you guys can help me become a big deal like Teresa Cardinal Brown. Thank you.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler, Teresa Cardinal Brown, and Hanadi Jordan. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you in 2 weeks.